A massive wave of demonstrations is building across the United States as a prominent grassroots organization announces plans for what organizers are calling the largest protest in American history. The event, scheduled for March 28th, represents the third in a series of nationwide demonstrations that have drawn millions to the streets over the past year, with particular attention now focused on one state that has become the epicenter of immigration enforcement tensions. The organization behind these coordinated protests, known as Indivisible, describes itself as a liberal grassroots network that emerged in response to concerns about executive power and democratic norms. The group has been organizing resistance efforts since the current administration took office, and their upcoming demonstration, referred to as No Kings 3, is expected to eclipse the scale of previous mobilizations. According to Ezra Levin, who serves as co-executive director of the nonprofit organization, early projections suggest that as many as 9 million people could participate in demonstrations across the country on that single day. To understand the significance of this prediction, it helps to look at the trajectory of previous No Kings protests. The movement launched its first major nationwide action on June 14th of last year, when demonstrations were organized in nearly 2,000 locations throughout all 50 states. That initial showing came in the wake of federal immigration enforcement operations and the deployment of National Guard and Marine units to Los Angeles, which sparked widespread concern among civil liberties advocates and immigrant rights groups. The second round of protests, held on October 18th, grew substantially larger. Organizers reported that more than 7 million people took to the streets in approximately 2,700 cities and towns across every state in the nation. The growth between these two events demonstrates the increasing momentum behind the movement, and organizers are now projecting that the March demonstration will represent another significant leap in participation. What has changed the character and focus of the upcoming protests is the situation unfolding in Minnesota, which has transformed from one of many protest locations into what organizers describe as ground zero for resistance to immigration enforcement policies. The state has witnessed an unprecedented deployment of federal resources in recent months, with roughly 3,000 federal agents sent to Minnesota as part of what the administration characterizes as an immigration crackdown. This operation represents the largest single immigration enforcement deployment of the current presidential term, and its scale has drawn national attention to the state. The Twin Cities area of Minneapolis and St. Paul will host the flagship march for the March 28th demonstrations, marking Minnesota's elevation to a central role in the protest movement. While Indivisible had already been planning spring demonstrations before the recent escalation in Minnesota, two tragic incidents have fundamentally reshaped the event's message and urgency. In recent weeks, two individuals named Alex Preety and Renee Good died during separate encounters with federal agents conducting immigration enforcement operations in the state. These fatalities have become rallying points for protesters who argue that enforcement tactics have become dangerously aggressive. The deaths occurred against a backdrop of mounting tension between federal authorities, local officials, and community activists in Minnesota. Demonstrations opposing immigration enforcement actions had already been growing in frequency and size throughout the state over several months before these incidents. Following the shootings, protests intensified dramatically, with thousands of demonstrators flooding the streets of Minneapolis to express outrage and demand accountability. Law enforcement declared at least one of these gatherings an unlawful assembly after determining that the protest was no longer peaceful, leading to arrests of what authorities described as agitators outside a hotel where federal operations were believed to be coordinated. The situation in Minnesota illustrates the complex dynamics that have made immigration enforcement such a contentious issue during this administration. For supporters of stringent enforcement, the deployment of thousands of agents represents a fulfillment of campaign promises to secure borders and remove individuals residing in the country without legal authorization. They argue that previous administrations failed to adequately enforce existing immigration laws, and that robust action is necessary to restore order to the immigration system and enhance public safety. For critics and protesters, however, the Minnesota operations exemplify what they view as excessive use of federal power that threatens civil liberties, tears apart families, and creates an atmosphere of fear in immigrant communities. The scale of deployment, the militarized appearance of some enforcement operations, and the tragic outcomes in the Preety and Good cases have fueled arguments that enforcement has crossed ethical and legal boundaries. Community organizations in Minnesota have reported that the heightened enforcement presence has driven many immigrants, including those with legal status, to avoid public spaces, keep children home from school, and refrain from seeking medical care or reporting crimes due to fear of encountering federal agents. The tension in Minnesota also reflects broader questions about federalism and the relationship between national and state authorities. Minnesota's state government has been more protective of immigrant communities than the federal administration, creating friction over enforcement priorities and tactics. Local law enforcement agencies in some Minnesota jurisdictions have declined to cooperate with certain federal immigration operations, citing concerns about community trust and resource allocation. This resistance from state and local officials has, in turn, prompted the federal government to conduct operations with minimal local coordination, which some observers argue has contributed to the volatile situations that led to the recent fatalities. The upcoming March demonstrations represent more than just opposition to immigration policy, according to organizers. Levin emphasized that the protests are fundamentally about the nature of democratic governance and the proper limits of executive authority. The No Kings framing deliberately evokes American Revolutionary-era rejection of monarchical power, suggesting that organizers view current policies as representing dangerous consolidation of authority in the executive branch. This constitutional and structural critique goes beyond specific policy disagreements to question whether democratic checks and balances are functioning as intended. When Levin stated that the protests are in large part a response to a combination of heinous attacks on our democracy and communities coming from the regime, and a sense that nobody's coming to save us, he articulated a perspective shared by many in the opposition movement. The use of the word regime rather than administration signals a view that current governance has departed from normal democratic norms. The phrase, "nobody's coming to save us," reflects a belief among activists that traditional institutional safeguards, including courts, Congress, and the media, have proven insufficient to constrain what protesters see as executive overreach, leaving grassroots mobilization as the primary available response. This framing helps explain why organizers predict such massive turnout for the March event. The movement is not positioning itself as supporting one political party against another in conventional partisan terms. Rather, organizers argue they are defending basic democratic principles that should transcend party affiliation. Levin made this explicit when he stated, "This isn't about Democrats versus Republicans. This is about whether we have a democracy at all." This appeal to nonpartisan democratic values is designed to broaden the movement's appeal beyond those who identify with progressive or liberal politics, potentially drawing support from independents and even some who might not oppose all of the administration's policies, but who share concerns about executive power and accountability. The organizational infrastructure supporting these protests has grown considerably more sophisticated since the movement's inception. Indivisible has developed from a small group of former congressional staffers sharing advice on effective advocacy into a nationwide network with local chapters in thousands of communities. The organization's model emphasizes decentralized action coordinated around shared goals and timing, allowing local groups to tailor their demonstrations to their communities while contributing to a larger national statement. This approach has proven effective at generating widespread participation while maintaining local relevance and ownership of the movement. Beyond the major protest days, organizers have announced plans for sustained activism and monitoring efforts. Training sessions are being organized nationwide to teach volunteers how to observe and document immigration enforcement activities. These training programs aim to create networks of monitors who can provide real-time information about enforcement operations, offer support to affected communities, and create documentation that can be used for legal challenges or public accountability efforts. This infrastructure development suggests that organizers view the March demonstration not as a culminating event, but as part of a longer-term campaign to maintain pressure and build capacity for ongoing resistance. The question of effectiveness inevitably arises with protests of this scale. Large demonstrations can generate significant media attention, signal the intensity of public concern, and provide emotional support and solidarity for participants. However, translating protest energy into concrete policy changes or electoral outcomes has historically been challenging. The administration has shown little indication that street demonstrations will alter its approach to immigration enforcement or other contested policies. Some observers argue that protests may even strengthen the administration's resolve by allowing it to frame opposition as coming from predictable partisan opponents rather than representing broad public concern. Nevertheless, organizers point to several ways that sustained mobilization can create meaningful impact. Large-scale protests can affect public opinion over time, particularly among those who are not strongly committed to either side of an issue. They can energize volunteer bases for electoral organizing, which may prove significant in upcoming elections. They can create pressure on elected officials at state and local levels to resist or decline cooperation with federal policies. And they can provide communities directly affected by policies with visible evidence that they have broader public support, which can be psychologically and practically important even when immediate policy victories are elusive. The Minnesota situation will serve as a critical test case as the March 28th demonstrations approach. If the state continues to experience heightened enforcement operations and community tensions in the coming weeks, it could further galvanize participation and intensity in the protests. Conversely, if there is any de-escalation or shift in enforcement approach, it might affect the urgency that organizers are trying to cultivate. The White House has pushed back against characterizations that leadership changes in Minnesota operations represent a retreat, insisting that strategy remains unchanged even as some personnel adjustments have been made. As March 28th draws closer, both supporters and opponents of the administration will be watching carefully to see whether Indivisible's prediction of 9 million participants proves accurate. If the turnout reaches anywhere near that level, it would indeed represent one of the largest coordinated demonstrations in American history, comparable to or exceeding the global protests against the Iraq War in 2003 or the Women's March in 2017. Such a showing would represent a significant political statement, regardless of its immediate policy impact, and would likely influence calculations about public sentiment heading into future electoral contests. The convergence of immigration enforcement tensions, concerns about executive authority, and grassroots organizing capacity has created conditions for what could be a historic moment in American protest movements, with Minnesota standing at the center of these intersecting currents of political conflict and civic mobilization.